A watch's finishing is one of the most impactful elements to its price and aesthetics. But many of us have no idea how each process is even done and why they cost so much. So to help with that, in this video, we're doing a deep dive into every finishing method in watches, explaining what they are, how they're done, and where each sits in the industry, from the most affordable mass manufactured finishes all the way up to the most prestigious techniques in all of horology. But first, what even is finishing? To put it simply, finishing is the manipulation of the surfaces on watch components after they're machined to achieve a specific appearance. The purpose is primarily decorative and to improve the overall aesthetic, although there are some practical benefits to some methods I'll get to. I'll be categorizing each by pricing tier, type of method, and what they're typically applied to as well. So let's start with the methods that form the foundation of all the others. Pretty much every watch on the market will have incorporated at least one or more of these. They're mass manufacturable and highly accessible. Brushing is the foundation that most major finishing techniques are based on. It's the first method of many that we'll be covering in the abrasives category. In its most simple form, brushing involves contacting a moving abrasive surface to a metal. The surface varies from sandpaper, industrial brushes, and other abrasive materials that can scratch the desired material. Brushing is defined primarily by the direction and motion of both the abrasive and the subject. Different combinations result in a variety of finishes, from satination, directional lines, to spiral patterns. The most basic and common of these combinations is linear brushing, which usually involves moving the component to an abrasive surface that's moving linearly relative to the watch. This achieves the classic brushed effect, thousands of parallel lines that form a directional flow, while maintaining a more matte appearance. This can be done by hand, or more commonly, by machine. Because of its simplicity and minimal required tooling, practically any manufacturer can utilize this, whether it's on movements, dials, or cases. While mostly an aesthetic choice, it does have the practical benefit of masking scratches quite well, as the finish itself is quite literally scratches. Circular brushing differentiates itself from linear in that the abrasive is rotating parallel to the surface of the object being brushed. The result is that instead of a straight lined brush, you get a circular pattern. You usually see this on the chapter ring of watches, although it's quite common in other applications as well, such as movements. When many think of a shiny or fancy watch, they're often associating that with polishing. Polishing is the yin to brushing's yang. Brushing's restrained and utilitarian aesthetic is perfectly contrasted with polishing's showy and reflective appearance. Ironically though, both brushing and polishing are abrasive techniques completed in nearly the exact same way, with polishing arguably being advanced brushing. It varies per manufacturer, but generally, soft buffing wheels are used with abrasive compounds to achieve the finish. On a micro level, abrasives are cutting tiny edges and valleys into the surface of a material. When light hits this rough surface, it spreads out chaotically against the edges and creates what is called a diffuse reflection. This is why brush watches look duller. As you move into finer grits, these valleys get smaller and smaller, until finally, differences between the valley heights is minimized to yield a smooth surface. This smooth surface reflects light at the same angle it hits the surface, resulting in a mirror-like effect. This is known as specular reflection, and it's the key distinction between polishing and brushing. Just like brushing, polishing is incredibly common. Movements, cases, and dials in every price bracket utilize it, although I'll be covering an even better form of it in a later tier. Bead blasting is on the opposite end of abrasive finishes from polishing. Instead of trying to achieve as shiny of a surface as possible, bead blasting's purpose is to make the metal as matte as possible. As the name suggests, the component is blasted with a stream of particles, often aluminum oxide, at high pressure. The result is an extremely fine, grainy surface that maximizes diffuse reflections through its high surface area, which gives a completely non-reflective finish. You're going to see this technique utilized mostly on the case, bezel, and bracelets of more tool-oriented watches. It'll usually, but not always, be in a more affordable price range too. Standout examples of brands that utilize it would be Hamilton and their khaki field line, and many of Zinn's watches too. Outside of brushing and polishing, electroplating is probably the most widely used finishing technique in the industry. Nearly every movement and dial utilizes it. Electroplating involves a process of creating an electrolytic cell, where the part and the plating metal are placed into an electrolyte solution. The part to be coated acts as a cathode, and when a current is sent through the cell, the plating metal dissolves in the solution and deposits on the outside of the cathode. What results is an exceptionally thin metal coating on the outside of the component, which typically takes on the finish of the material below it. Most watch movement components and dials are made of brass, which tarnishes over time. To combat this, these parts are nearly always plated, typically with rhodium in the case of movements. Of course, this can be done on the outside of the watch too, and was quite frequently in the past. But because the outside of the watch requires durability, the industry has mostly transferred to another method I'll touch on in the next tier. Sunburst patterns are the first of the abrasive techniques that require two axes of motion to achieve it. It's similar to linear brushing in that a perpendicular brushing wheel is used, but this time, the component is also rotated slowly, and the brush is applied only to the radius of the circle. The result is a subtle pattern with lines emanating from the center point of the circle to the outer edge, giving the finish its namesake. While most know this as a classic dial finish, it's also commonly used on movements, particularly on the ratchet and crown wheels, as well as automatic rotors. I would consider this to be the bare minimum for a movement to even be considered decorated beyond the factory machine finish. You'll also rarely see this on cases too, usually on the bezel or spaced around the crystal of the watch to draw the eye towards the center of the design. Not to be confused with heat bluing, chemical bluing is a process used by more budget watch manufacturers to mimic the look of a thermally blued component. The method varies, but generally, this involves dipping the part into a chemical solution to achieve a blue color. While it looks similar, it lacks the deep blue color and advantages of a traditionally blued part, namely the durability it provides to watchmakers working with these components. You'll see this most commonly on both movement screws and hands on more budget watches. It isn't necessarily a bad technique in and of itself, but it's often looked down upon because its entire purpose is to copy the look of a higher end method. If you enjoy these sort of detailed scientific deep dives on topics and watches, consider subscribing if you haven't already. These videos require quite a bit of research and editing to make, and joining helps me know what to make more of. Thanks. Let's move on to the entry-level luxury finishing techniques you'll start to see in watches of a slightly higher price. All of these differentiate themselves as methods that are a little more difficult and time-consuming to achieve than the previous level. Perlage, meaning beading or pearl, is a more specific form of circular brushing that's smaller and repeated. It's created by pressing a small spinning abrasive into the surface and repeating the process in equidistant positions on the component to achieve a repeated pearl look. It's one of the most common movement finishing techniques usually utilized on plates and bridges. Because perlage is among the most traditional movement finishes that can be done by hand, it usually starts to show up in the entry-level space. It's also the first among the list of abrasive finishes that has a practical advantage. Because the scratches created by the abrasive are rather large, stray dust inside the movement will catch on the finish, preventing the particles from getting between the teeth of the wheels or into the lubrication throughout the movement. Have you ever noticed that some subdials have fine ribbed concentric circles on them? This pattern is called azurage, and it's the first subtractive method on this list. It's achieved in a way similar to perlage, but in reverse. The component itself is spun around the center of the subdial, and a cutting implement is moved to it to cut the ridges. In this way, it's a simple form of engine turning or guilloche, which I'll get to in more detail later on. This is almost entirely seen on the subdials of a watch, especially chronographs, but there are some brands that utilize it in other ways, such as on the entire dial. It's not the most exciting finish, but it adds extra detail and reflects light uniquely, similar to a record. Laser engraving is one of the more modern techniques on this list. Unlike most of the other techniques that require physical tool-on-component interactions, laser engraving, or etching, uses a computer-operated laser to remove microscopic layers of material from the surface of the metal via ablation. Instead of the material being cut, it is essentially vaporized. This has the benefit of being more accurate and faster than hand engraving, and a fairly economical technique to use for intricate designs or recessed text. It may lack a mostly human touch, but it has found its niche and usefulness in the industry, particularly on the exterior of the watch like bezels, casebacks, and clasps, although brand logos and text added to movements are common too. PVD, or physical vapor deposition, is a technique similar in intention to plating, but achieved through a completely different methodology. Instead of through an electrolytic cell, the part is put inside a vacuum chamber that vaporizes and condenses a thin film of material over it. For movements and dials, this has the distinct advantage over plating of having a wider range of colors available, but the downside of lower material variety. Rhodium PVD is simply not common or possible as far as I'm aware, for example. Of course, it still retains the usefulness of protection too, particularly when used on the case of the watch, which provides significantly more durability, mainly due to the nature of the bond's strength in comparison to plating. PVD is becoming increasingly common in the industry, especially so in replacing budget gold-toned watches, which slots it right into the entry-level tier. Striping is perhaps the most prolific and traditional movement finish there is. When you think of a nicely finished movement, you probably think of Côte de Genève, also known as Geneva stripes, although there are many variations, such as Haute striping. Between all of them, the basic technique is largely the same. which is somewhat similar to the setup for perlage. This time though, the abrasive has a larger radius and is tilted at a very slight angle. The component is held in place while the abrasive tip is moved across its surface linearly in overlapping passes, forming the uniform scratches. This yields the iconic wave pattern that reflects light in quite a unique way. And just like perlage, this also captures dust particles, perhaps even better too. Although it's been associated with luxury movements in the past, these days its prestige has worn off slightly, with it becoming quite accessible starting in the entry-level bracket. Even so, Geneva striping is a technique that improves in quality as you move up in price. The execution on higher-end watches is more refined and aesthetic, and sometimes even more complex, such as radial striping. Snelling is another classic movement finish that's essentially a circular form of Geneva waves. The setup is similar in principle, but with the finished surface spinning in the opposite direction to the abrasive, which is pressed to the surface off-center. This yields the same sort of spiralized circle pattern, but now radially instead of stripes, which reflects the light like a snail shell. It's typically found on the same components you'd expect to see sunburst finishes, mainly ratchet and crown wheels among others. Snelling is seen more as a traditional technique, so it isn't as common these days, but you still start to see it in the entry-level up to lower middle luxury brands such as Nomos. Anodization is another way to add color and exterior resistance to a metal. It's achieved through the same process as electroplating, as a component in an electrolytic cell. But as the name suggests, the anodized piece acts as the anode. While the current flows through the cell, a protective oxide layer forms over the piece. Because of this, anodization can only be done with a few specific metals, namely aluminum and titanium for watches. Achieving color for each is different though. For aluminum, dyes must be used in the electrolyte solution to achieve different colors. The oxidized surface is porous, and the dye gets trapped inside the surface as it forms. Because of this, the aluminum can anodize to practically any color imaginable. Titanium's color, on the other hand, is determined by the applied voltage to the cell. Different voltages correspond to different oxide thicknesses, which in turn varies the wavelengths of light that are reflected by the surface. This yields a smaller but still large variety of colors without the need for dyes. Because it's restricted to specific metals, anodization is usually only used on individual components like subdials, hands, or aluminum bezels. There are some watches that have entirely anodized cases, but they are few and far between. Moving on to the luxury finishing techniques, we start to see methods that are more specialized, time-consuming, and skill-intensive. These start to show up in watches that are beyond what most would consider to be entry-level, into competent and deliberately well-finished watches. Heat bluing is one of the most classic and naturally interesting finishing methods. It's quite similar to titanium anodization in that it involves creating an oxide layer on the outside of the metal to achieve a range of colors. While anodization's color is dependent on voltage, heat bluing's color is determined by the temperature. Traditionally, this is used on small parts such as screws or hands in a container on a bed of brass shavings to ensure a uniform temperature distribution. The container is fired into the part as the proper color and removed. The process requires a significant amount of preparation and precision, as the color only happens in a small time window and is not always uniform. In contrast to anodization, heat bluing can be done on a wider range of metals, but with a smaller range of colors. Steel, titanium, and tantalum are the most common, with colors going from yellows, browns, purples, and darker or lighter blues. When properly executed, it's quite unlike almost any other coloring technique. Since the process is so finicky, small parts are usually the focus to achieve consistency. Bluing could be considered in an even higher tier when applied to larger parts though. Specifically, brands like de Bethune blue entire cases. The result is incredibly impressive given the uniformity of the color. Skeletonization is a simple enough method to digest. It's when materials are removed from components to allow you to see other parts behind them. It's a fairly broad category, and arguable whether it's even technically finishing. No particularly novel techniques are required for it, besides machining the parts with the holes in mind. But what makes it special is that it shows off more of the other finishes, not its own aesthetic. For some, this added visual complexity creates too much of a busy aesthetic. But from the perspective of the watchmaker, large components like rotors or bridges hide much of the craftsmanship that went into the movement. Its acceptability is going to depend on the resultant look, and in many cases, the prestige or brand. Of course, this is primarily a movement technique, but open heart dials are an example of how it can be utilized in other ways. Frosting is a sort of upgraded or higher contrast version of the bead blasted texture, but through a variety of different methods. First, we have abrasive techniques such as straight graining. These are essentially omnidirectional brushing in a way, and achieve a more subtle look. Next, we have a new category for this list, mechanical texturing. In contrast to other methods that remove material, mechanical texturing deforms the surface through mechanical means. For frosting, this involves hitting the surface in some way many times to achieve a textured appearance. Many companies press wire brushes into the surface to create texture, for example. On an industrial scale, AP uses the Florentine technique of hammering a diamond-tipped tool onto their frosted royal oaks. There are also subtractive techniques such as tremblage, which are effectively a specific form of engraving. The texture appearance is created by engraving thousands of tiny divots onto the surface. This is by far the most time-consuming method, and could be considered a high luxury or even hot horology method depending on the complexity. And lastly, we have chemical techniques. While not super common anymore, historically, Breguet frosting was a method used that involved oxidizing the metal and removing that layer with acid. There are a few brands that still do this, namely America's J.N. Shapiro, and it achieves a soft white texture. Hammering is a more specific type of frosting in a way, but unlike frosting that has a fine texture, hammering as a process isn't limited to a specific size and shape. When the tool contacting the surface is larger, different, almost scaly textures can be achieved. Coarser textures also have the distinct advantage of requiring fewer impacts, which lowers the amount of labor required. It's not a super common technique, but its utilization starts around the luxury area, particularly with watches like Lucky Harvey's hammer dials. It could also be said the so-called stamping on dials falls into this category too, as the process is largely the same, although I'll be addressing that in a later technique. Lacquering is a relatively common process used to achieve a glossy effect on the dial of the watch. While not very interesting in and of itself, lacquering is effectively a combination of many of the previous techniques. The dial is first either plated or treated with the PVD in order to color and protect it. Then, multiple layers of lacquer are applied and then polished to get the desired finish, which is usually a shiny, wet, or inky look. What makes this method alluring is often the variations from different manufacturers and cultures around the world. Grand Seiko and Manet's urushi lacquer and Awake's utilization of the traditional sunmai technique are just a few of the many examples. Next up is the high luxury tier. All of these are traditional techniques mostly done by hand with the aid of machines when possible. They require a significant amount of specialized skill and labor to produce, and they form the basis of methods used in high-end watch finishes and aesthetics. Black polish is a similar but upgraded form of polishing. The key difference is that regular industrial polishing is a soft surface polish. Usually a buffing wheel is used. Black polishing is a hard surface polish, typically with a tin block or other hard material. This allows for a perfectly flat surface to be achieved, which eliminates diffusion entirely. The result is a surface that reflects completely black or white depending on the angle, and acts as a perfect mirror. Because there isn't a malleable abrasive conforming to the workpiece, the angle at which the black polishing is done must be extremely precise. The process is laborious and time-consuming, as the surface needs to be immaculate to achieve the desired effect. This is what puts it in the high luxury tier. Traditionally, black polish is used on small movement components such as screws or bevels, which I'll get to in a moment, although there are other applications as well, such as Grand Seiko and Creedor's Zaratsu polishing, which is technically a form of black polish, but on the case of the watch. Anglage or chamfering is another traditional luxury finishing technique that involves filing 90-degree edges in a movement down to 45-degree angles and polishing the resultant bevel. When properly executed, the edges of larger movement parts will have a reflective band along them, which adds significant refinement and aesthetic intrigue to the movement. With modern technology, much of the simplistic geometries and large surfaces can be chamfered by machine, but many intricate shapes still require hand shaping and filing by a watchmaker. Because of this, anglage is one of the most time-consuming and difficult finishing techniques so far. Maintaining a perfect 45-degree bevel on internal edges and curved parts requires a significant amount of patience and skill, which firmly puts this into the high luxury tier, or even higher depending on the complexity. When moving into higher tiers, watchmakers will round these angles even further to give an even cleaner look, all the way to the extreme with technique called bressage, that involves completely rounding over arms in a movement. Countersinking can be considered a more specialized version of anglage, but for circular holes on the movement for both screws and jewels. The idea is to bevel and black polish the internal edge of these holes. Beyond the polish aesthetic, this also serves the advantage of allowing screwheads to sit flush with their bridge or plates, which further refines the look. This method is typically done by hand, but with specific countersink tools that make the process a bit quicker than traditional anglage. It's a technique you really only see on higher-end luxury movements, as it's hand finish and ultimately superfluous. Of all the techniques in high horology finishing, none are more famous than the category of guilloche. It's a classic technique involving the engraving of repeated patterns into a material, traditionally through engine turning, where a watchmaker uses a manually operated machine to cut geometric patterns, usually onto a watch dial. The most common of these specialty machines is called a rose engine, which requires a large amount of labor from a highly skilled watchmaker to utilize. Using a pantograph is another method, which allows for a larger mock-up of the design to be replicated on a smaller scale. and removes much of the human element of the work. This has been extended even further into modern watchmaking with the use of CNC and automated guilloche as well, although this is less common in higher-end watches. And as I mentioned previously, stamp dials exist, although they usually lack many of the finer details that make guilloche so enticing. Because of the geometric nature of guilloche patterns, an endless amount of designs exist, many of which with their own unique names. Common aesthetics involve the design emanating from the center of the dial, with repeated spirals, waves, or lines overlapping from each other as it moves toward the edge. Haute Horology and Craftsman is our final tier. Watches with these techniques usually set themselves at the highest end of the craft. These methods are all quite rare to see, and are done almost entirely by hand and in low quantities. Mistakes will essentially ruin the part, so highly skilled individual craftsmen are required. Hand engraving is likely the most obvious Haute Horology finishing technique because of how time-consuming it is. It's usually done with the burin, a multifaceted pointed tool used to carve out V-shaped grooves from the surface of the metal. As the craftsman uses the burin, they must have an incredibly steady and skilled hand with controlled movements to ensure a perfect result. This is why hand engraving is typically reserved for small sections on a watch or small batch runs. Within the category of engraving, there are several sub-methods, such as relief engraving, frosting and hammering as I mentioned before, and even three-dimensional techniques like sculpting, which you'll find on watches from brands like Jacob & Co. or MB&F. The complexity will vary anywhere from movement engraving on Glashütte Rugenau's watches to incredibly detailed dials from high horology watchmakers, and even in rare examples, entire cases are engraved. Damascening is a category of techniques that was utilized mainly in pocket watches, and has largely died out in the modern watch industry. The term itself is exclusively an American one, as a more encompassing word for the family of pattern techniques like perlage or Côte de Genève. The difference though, is that damascening is far more intricate, primarily because of its usage of methods similar to spirographs. Rose edges were used with abrasives to create highly detailed patterns that look entirely unique to the traditional European methods. The result looks like holographic basket weaving, checkerboards, flowers, and more depending on the design. The technique yields a highly ornate and textured look, unlike almost any other. As large-scale US watch manufacturing died off in the mid-20th century, most examples of it are on historical pocket watches and pieces made pre-1950. That I know of, J.N. Shapiro is the only watchmaker still using damascening in their pieces, albeit in a more modern and striping style. Because of its rarity and current usage in low-volume high horology pieces, I believe it belongs in the Craftsman category. The last technique I have to cover is enameling. At its base, enameling is a process that involves using powdered glass paints to create designs on a dial. The dial is then fired, which sets the enamel into a hard and often glossy material. The category itself encompasses a great number of sub-techniques, all of which fall under Grand Fou enamel, which involves several refirings, giving it a relatively high failure rate. Because of this, and that the process is done entirely by hand, enameling is typically reserved for the upper echelons of watchmaking. Of the main types, there are single color dials that have a similar aesthetic to lacquer, cloisonné that involves using thin gold wires to create shapes and pictures, flanqué, which is essentially enameling over guilloche, miniature paintings that involve incredible intricate works of art, and many more that I don't have the time to cover in just this video. Many of the top and most famous watchmakers have utilized enameling in one way or another, such as Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, or a Longonzona. There are a few noteworthy examples of more affordable brands utilizing the technique though, which is impressive in and of itself, of which Anordain's Model 1 comes to mind. While deciding on the obscure reference for this video, the first brands that came to mind for finishing were Grand Seiko and Creedor, which I realized that I've yet to feature in this segment before. So today's reference, Creedor's GCLL993, is a perfect example of a plethora of methods for a pretty great price. This watch is a bit of a strange one. It's one of the only spring drive moon phases ever made, and has a decidedly funky dial. Between the divisive massive number markers, the entire dial utilizes azurage, concentric circles, stepped in several different ways and thicknesses. Of course, the hands and indices are a perfect mixture of polishing and brushing, and the outer chapter ring appears to be media blasted. Flipping the watch over, the azurage theme continues on the main bridge, which is completely beveled with the screws and jewels countersunk. The ratchet wheel is sunburst, and the rotor is fascinating in its own right, with a pseudo-sunburst engraved texture. Of course, the watch is encased in a Zaratsu polished and linear brushed case, with multiple bevels to the lugs and bezel as well. Even if you don't care for the dial, you have to respect the beauty and intricacy of the finishing on it, especially given the price, which is right around middle-range used Grand Seikos. The catch though, if you haven't already guessed it, is that this was a limited edition of only 125 pieces, so it's incredibly difficult to find. Luckily, there are a few other similar references, such as the 999, but still, it's a shame Creedor doesn't make mid-luxury pieces like this much anymore. Many of these finishing techniques are so commonplace that I think we lose sight of how complex and complicated they are to pull off, and how they contribute to the cost of a watch. Finishing is often the most important aspect of the aesthetic, and in most cases, what sets a watch apart from the pack. Even though I split these techniques into 5 tiers, it's important to note that these were just rough groupings, and many high-end techniques are starting to show up in more budget releases, and vice versa. Every method has its place. It's how they're executed and used in relation to others that matters. But hopefully this video was educational in an entertaining way. Let me know in the comments, what's your favorite finishing method? I'm personally a fan of the classics like guilloche, snailing, and striping, but I've come to respect a good quality brushed finish as I've grown as a collector. And if you like this video format, be sure to watch my other ranking videos, like my recent one covering every case material in watches. It's a deep dive into 29 different materials, several of which I can guarantee you've never heard of before. Thank you for taking the time to watch.